Right, good afternoon, and thank you everyone for joining us at our online event about procedural justice. This event is particularly focused on the theme of safety, security and stability in prisons, and our intention is this will be the first of a series, each with a different theme related to procedural justice. My name's Flora Fitzalan-Howard. I work in the evidence-based practice team of HMPPS. The work of our team is to serve all parts of our service, bringing the best available quality scientific evidence to inform what we do and how we do it, to give us the best chance of improving outcomes for the people in our care, for our colleagues, and ultimately for the public. For the last few years, a lot of my work has been on the topic of procedural justice, and there has been a huge amount of fantastic work by others all across the service, either in developing their own professional development, in thinking about how we lead and manage others, or how we develop processes or rethink some of the things that we do. We know we've got a lot more to do, but today is about sharing the work and experience of some of our colleagues in the hope that it will talk a little bit more about the practice and real life around procedural justice. So just as a few reminders, well, firstly, an apology. I understand there might have been some issues with the joining link, and for that, I am sorry. I am hoping that people who were hoping to join, have managed to. Please can I remind you to keep your microphones muted, but do keep your cameras on if you wish. The event is being recorded. A copy of this will be sent to you after the event, along with any slides. So I'm very pleased today to introduce my esteemed panel. We have Ralph Lubkowski, who is Governor of HMP Hewell. We have Phil Riding, Head of Res from HMYOI Hindley. Amy Friel, who comes to us from the Risk and Capabilities Unit in our Security Directorate, and Winston Carnegie, Head of Safeguarding at Warrington. Throughout the conference, you can use the chat function to ask questions for the panelists, and when we've all finished doing our little bits, we will move on to a Q&A session, and those questions will be put to the panel members. If you wish a question to be directed specifically at one of the panel members, do just include that in the chat. And if we don't have time to answer all the questions, we will send out a sort of Q&A document afterwards. So to begin today's session, I want to briefly introduce or remind, I imagine some of you are very familiar with this concept, so it may be a reminder of what we mean by procedural justice. So when we feel treated in a fair and just way, by which I mean specifically when we feel that processes are being applied to us or procedures are being done that affect us or decisions are being made about us in a way that we feel is fair, we see those people in authority as more positively. We see their decisions and actions as something we can respect. We see their authority as being more legitimate. And as a consequence of that, we are more likely to be able to accept and respect the decisions that they make and to willingly cooperate or comply with what it is they're asking of us. There are 4 principles, procedural justice. These are the things that help us to feel that the way things are being done by those in authority is fair. Firstly, we have voice. So this is the fact that we need to feel that we're part of the process. We can tell our side of the story or our version of events when decisions are being made, that we are listened to seriously, that our questions can be answered, and that those consultations are genuine rather than perhaps after the fact. The second is neutrality. We need to believe that people in authority are being open and transparent, unbiased and consistent in the way they use authority and go about doing that. We need to really understand how decisions were reached or how rules were created or how changes are going to affect us. And we need to believe that this is free from bias. The third is trustworthy motives. So we need to believe that what is motivating those people who are making decisions about us are genuinely sincere and principled, that they are trying to do what is right or have people's best interests at heart, rather than being perhaps having ulterior or hidden motives. And finally, respect. We need to feel that we're being treated with respect, with dignity and courtesy, that our rights are respected and protected. You know, good mantra for this is no decision about me without me. The concept of procedural justice has a long history, as does the research around this, going back many decades. In the last decade, though, we have seen a real development of the evidence looking at how important this is in custodial settings, looking at what kind of outcomes for who and to what degree these perceptions have an influence. Now, I'm not sharing all of the outcomes influence. I'm just focusing on those that are related to the theme of today's event. But what we have is robust scientific evidence that tells us that when people who are living in prison feel that the way authority is being used is procedurally just, i.e. they have a voice, they're treated respectfully, they trust the motives in those people working in prisons and believe that authority is being used in a neutral way, it is associated with a host of significantly better outcomes. We see significantly better behaviour, less rule breaking from, day-to-day rules and instructions to concerted indiscipline or assaults. We see significantly better emotional and psychological health of people in our care. And even beyond the immediate effects it might have on someone's well-being or behaviour, in some cases we see that effect lasting and extending beyond the prison gates and influencing future reoffending. So procedural justice is all about how authority is used rather than the outcome of authority. So how a decision is reached rather than what decision is reached. The research is pretty clear that even though, of course, the fairness of the outcomes matters, it's a slightly different type of justice perception, how those are being done, how we are treated, influences a significant influence on how we feel and then how we react. So that's a brief introduction, and I'm now going to hand over to Ralph, and he is going to share his experiences and perceptions from the perspective of being a governing governor of a prison. Hi, Ralph.
Hi, Flora. Thanks very much. Hello, everybody. It's nice to be here. So I was thinking about how to reflect on this on my perspective, and I'm going to specifically focus around Hull. I'm the governor of HMP Hull. Been there now for 16 months, and it's been quite a significant distance travelled in that time, actually, which has been really interesting and probably progressed quicker than I expected. And so I was thinking, how has procedural justice played a part in that? And I think what I would particularly like to focus on today is the concept of individual well-being and how that's contributed to and in turn contributes to procedural justice, and I guess those outcomes that we're all looking for around safe and decent and rehabilitative prisons. So just to give a little bit of context, Hull's a prison performance support programme site, so was identified just less than 2 years ago now as one of the 6 worst performing prisons in the country, and as such is sort of received support around that. So that's a little bit of context for those of you that aren't familiar with Hull. So this is from the perspective of a prison that was really struggling. Latest data suggests that actually Hull's now 73rd in the number of assaults on staff and 58th in terms of the amount of violence between prisoners. So clearly there's been a dramatic improvement in some of those key outcomes. So why has that happened? Well, I think at the core of it has been a focus on the individual, and focusing on the individual and understanding their needs, and then making sure that we do everything we can to try and meet those needs, which sounds simple, but in the context of a large prison with 50% reception population and 50% resettlement population, you can imagine the needs in Hull, as in all other prisons, is absolutely enormous, and there's a huge range of things that we need to try and deal with. But first and foremost, I think it comes down to an issue of trust. So if I'm going to create an environment, and if we as a prison are going to create an environment where the prisoners can trust in us that we are there working with them and alongside them and for them to try and give them the opportunity to make the changes they need to make in their lives, make the better choices they need to make, we need to be able to create that trust. And first and foremost, as Flora's mentioned, that's about trust in process. and others will talk about trust in process. And there's some really obvious things there, like how effective are we at dealing with our complaints? How effective are we at dealing with applications? But I want to focus a little bit on how it goes a little bit deeper than that. And because core to this is relationships. We know that it's relationships within a prison setting that have the potential to make those really significant changes that need to happen. And relationships, of course, have to be built on trust. You know, no good relationship can maintain where there isn't trust between both parties. That, and in the context of Huel, it's about trust that actually we are there genuinely trying to care and create those opportunities for people to change. So how do you then build that trust? And how do you then create that trust? Well, of course, process and procedure is a part of that. But really, what I think sits at the heart of it is, how do we create an environment where individuals, prisoners who have a significant, in many cases, lack of trust for authority, have probably been in prisons before and have found that that was not a productive or positive experience for them, hence one of the reasons why they're back. And then they obviously have an inherent mistrust when they arrive as to what's going to happen with them and why. So focusing on the needs of the individual and focusing on listening, and as Flora mentioned about voice, actually listening to what it is that they're saying, understanding what it is that they really need to enable them to make that progression. But understanding and hearing them is one part of that, and that's absolutely vital. Of course, the issue is then, if we don't then do something with that, and we don't then actually manage to recognise their progression, understand the journey that they're on, and create the opportunities for them to then deal with the needs that we've worked with them to identify, any trust that you've built up in the short term will go, because they will say, well, you told me this was going to happen and it hasn't happened. You told me there'd be these opportunities, and where are they? You know, you told me you cared, actually, and I don't feel cared for. And in really simple terms, I think that's absolutely critical. So how does that happen? Well, I think it happens by making sure that we understand and look at this wider concept of well-being. My apologies. So well-being in terms of thinking of that in the broadest possible sense. So not just their health needs, their substance misuse issues, the issues they may have around mental health illnesses or concerns, but actually thinking more broadly around those issues around anxiety, around mistrust, around the issues that they have in terms of their relationships in the past, which have probably not been particularly positive and may well still not be positive influences on them. And so by looking at that holistic understanding of well-being, and then making prisoners understand that actually that's what we are focusing on, and that we are going to recognise each individual for their own individual circumstances, and then enable them to make the progression that they need to make, I think then you start to see some really interesting outcomes. One way that we've done that at Huel, for example, is focusing on not just rewarding those who come in and know how to play the system and understand how to play the game, and those of you who work in prisons, the sort of chaps who will come in and very quickly find themselves working on the servery or working in good jobs, therefore accessing high rates of pay, therefore being able to afford not to get into significant amounts of debt, and they understand how to navigate the system. But many of our men simply will not be in a place to be able to do that. So they will not be able to access all of those things. And actually thinking of that from a procedural justice perspective, that isn't procedurally just. Actually, it isn't just, full stop, but it certainly isn't procedurally just, because they will see that there's a ceiling to their progression. They will only be ever able to get so far within our system. So what we've done at Huel is we've created different pathways, and many of those pathways are the traditional pathways towards employment. But one of those pathways is around a pathway that is our well-being pathway. And that's about acknowledging that when we have that conversation with an individual, when we're trying to build that trust, and when we're trying to create a sense in them that they can have hope that there is a chance for progression, we need to understand that distance travelled for each individual in terms of their journey and how much we should recognise and reflect and reward that will be very different. I use an example of one of our men on our Oak unit at the moment. Probably the biggest success story we have in Huel at the moment is a gentleman who was only just starting to come to the servery to collect his own meal. Now, traditionally within the prison system, there's no means of recognising that. There's no way in which we reflect that back at him and say, well done, that's incredible progress. So actually, in terms of some of those things that Flora talked about, does that show that we really care? Does that show that we really recognise what that individual is achieving? It doesn't. So what we've created at Huel is a wellbeing pathway that enables us to map that journey for our most complex and vulnerable men in a very different way, so that we can actually reflect that progress. And in a very practical way, for example, we're linking our pay policy to that. So pay will no longer be based on where an individual is worked. It'll be based on the progress an individual has made. So when somebody comes into prison and we say to them, we want you to engage and we want you to make progression and we want you to deal with your needs, actually what we often do is then we very quickly stop recognizing or reflecting or rewarding that person's journey, because they might not hit the necessary boxes that we traditionally recognize as showing progression. And we expect somebody, for example, who's never engaged with education to come into prison in a chaotic situation with all their support mechanisms unavailable to them, and all of a sudden decide they're going to attend education. And they have every right, I think, to turn around and say, well, seriously, you know, how is that supporting or assisting me? I have a range of issues that stop me doing that, and you're not recognizing that. You're not hearing my voice, and you're not giving me the opportunity to make that progression, or at least you're not rewarding the progression that you see. So for us, for that gentleman who's going to collect his dinner, he might well be considered actually for a higher rate of pay, because he's made just as significant progress against his individual needs as a gentleman that comes in and has very quickly gets himself into a good job, is working towards a degree because he's already A-level educated, etc., etc. So there's something, so at the core of this for me, in terms of how you embed it within a prison and how you embed procedural justice within a prison, comes back to understanding the individual, understanding how do we create trust in them that they will be supported and recognised in meeting their needs, so that we can then reinforce that success and reinforce that achievement through all the work that we do. A really concrete example on a more sort of simplistic level, I guess, at Huel was we did some work around cell smash-ups. So about 18 months ago, Huel had more cell smash-ups than any other prison in the system. It was costing huge amounts of money. So a piece of research was done, and basically the conclusion was, in 2 words, procedural justice, because there wasn't any. And some of that was around response to complaints and applications, but actually a lot of that was around relationships, because the prisoners simply didn't believe that the staff cared. And actually the staff did care, but they didn't have the mechanism and weren't empowered to actually demonstrate that through practical measures that they were able to take. Either they were simply rushed off their feet or unable to deal with that, or the culture didn't exist where actually it was encouraged and recognised and rewarded that they should be focusing on that individual. So for the staff, that's an incredibly frustrating position, because they do care. 99.9% of our staff, I think, care deeply about what happens to the men in our care. But prisoners couldn't see that in action because the staff simply didn't have the means with which, and actually the systems and the structures that we had in place simply didn't allow for the recognition of those small steps that sometimes actually are enormous steps in the journey that somebody takes to real change. So cell smash-ups are now hugely reduced. In the last 3 months, we've only had 1 cell fire, for example, and a very small number of incidents at height, which again for Huel is a huge shift. So I think it's a slightly different way of looking at it, and there's some obvious fixes in there in terms of how you conduct yourself in terms of those decision-making processes. But critical to what we're doing is linking it in with key worker. So you would hope, and we would expect and look to achieve, that the most trusting relationship in a prison will be between a key worker and the prisoner. So actually, wouldn't it make sense from a procedural justice point of view to put the decision-making authority in the hands of the key worker and the POM, who are the person that best knows the individual and best understands their needs and where they need to go, and best placed to recognise them? So the system we're putting in place at Huel, and I stress we've got a way to go with this, it's nowhere near the finished article, but the system that will be in place at Huel is progression and allocation to activity and pay will all come through the POM and fundamentally the key worker. So it empowers the key worker to be able to reward and recognise and encourage progression in that individual. And that's where the trust, I hope, will sit, because the trust ultimately will sit in that relationship and sit within that structure and process of all of those different things. But at the heart of that will be somebody that knows that person and that prisoner will trust. Of course, there's a lot of development work to do there with the staff. So getting staff to buy into and understand that's really crucial. But as I said at the start, most staff really want to make a difference and they want to see the people in their care improve and develop and progress. So giving them the tools to make that happen and empowering them to then make the decisions that are critical to that prisoner and encourage them to make decisions themselves is absolutely critical. And I think cuts across all those 4 strands that Flora talked about at the start. So that's a personal reflection from the perspective of Huel. And we're still working through how and why we've made a lot of the progress that we've made. But I think at the heart of it, this concept of well-being and our values of be honest, be kind and be fair, there are 3 values, that's what we work to. Procedural justice sits right through that. And by continuing to focus on that, I'm confident that we'll continue to make the improvements that we've been making. And at the heart of that is the whole concept of procedural justice, how it links to rehab culture, but also the critical part it plays in relationships, and most importantly, trust within those relationships to ensure that they're positive and progressive and effective. And that's a reflection from me, and more than happy to take questions. I know we've got plenty of time for questions at the end, so there's lots more I could talk about, but I'll leave it there and hand back to Flora.
Thank you, Ralph. I sort of feel really inspired by that. And I love that sort of real sense that if we don't have trusting relationships, we can't get very far. And that if we're truly going to have those relationships, seeing people as individuals and throughout, and then what changes need to be made to make sure that we actually live by that, whether, and I like what we're talking about, whether it's how we think about progress, for example, to make it individual, how we decide who has the authority to make decisions, who's best placed. If we're really truly going to see individuals as individuals, it feels quite a very different way of doing things. And I would really, I'd love to hear how you get on as it progresses. It sounds, well, very procedurally just and very much a living your values at Huel. Thank you. Thanks, before I hand on to the next person, I just want to say again, just an apologies. I understand a few people joined late because of that issue with the link. I am very sorry for that. The recording will be shared afterwards, so if you missed anything, you'll be able to access it then. But yeah, I'm sorry, it's not an ideal way to begin an event. So thank you, Ralph. I'm now going to pass over to Phil Riding. Phil is coming to us from, well, talking to us from a perspective of using procedural justice in adjudication, disciplinary adjudications. And so, Phil, with no further ado, I'm going to pass over to you.
Okay, thanks, Flora. Good afternoon, everybody. So like Flora said, I've been asked to sort of give you my experience of adjudications and how we use procedural justice around that. It's probably important just to explain the journey I've been on in respect of that. So I guess about 4 years ago now, I linked up with Flora and we engaged all our adjudicators at Hindley and did some procedural justice training. And it was, I guess it was 2 full days training, as I remember correctly. And I've tried to recall what I remember from that training and about the skills that we tried to push into adjudications to try and get the outcomes that both Flora and Ralph have spoken about there. And I know Ralph has sort of approached this from a much broader perspective than I'm doing in respect of adjudications, but I thought the best thing to do, just to apply some context to what procedural justice means in an adjudication room and how you actually get it, would be probably more insightful to you as an audience, and then I'll talk a little bit about what I think about it. I've been doing adjudications for, I guess, 12 years, And I like to think I've been doing more rehabilitative adjudications in the last 4 years since that training. So some of the things that we look at are that I'm certainly a lot more considerate of when I'm doing an adjudication is about that trust element and how you get that and how you build rapport straight away. And these, I guess, these rehabilitative skills I'm going to just talk very briefly about that we spoke and did role plays about over 2 years. It feels like I'm very much probably teaching people to suck eggs, because a lot of it is very basic behaviours that we all use in human interactions. But I think what the training gave me is a clear insight into the impact that those behaviours could actually have on a prisoner who was subject to what is quite a difficult process for a prisoner to experience, sort of thing. So the first thing was about building trust and developing a positive relationship with the prisoner, and that starts very much from the word go, from good morning, have I met you before, how long have you been here, and just building up a little bit of just breaking down that formal barrier that exists in an adjudication. And then there's a small bit of actively listening. Now, I know that you have to listen in adjudication. All adjudicators have to listen to get appropriate information on an adjudication. But the way in which you listen and actively listen and use body language to demonstrate to that person that you are listening adds value to the process for them. Giving people choices and hope. So that's about helping people understand their choices and instilling hope that they can change and do things differently. So just this morning, I did an adjudication as an example for a prisoner who was found with 10 litres of hooch in his cell. Now, my expectation was that I was going to punish him as harshly as I could on the limited awards that we have as adjudicating governors. But actually, what I did is I explored, would he engage with our SMS services? Did he have a problem with alcohol, and was there any worth in that engagement? And what we actually agreed to do was suspend the award pending him actually engaging with SMS services, which, you know, he was more than happy with. He had something like 5 months left. He had no intention of engaging with services, but I actually used it as a motivating factor to get him to engage. Socratic questioning. So that's something I use specifically around abuse of staff and the position that prisoner behaviours put staff in, and try to get them through Socratic questioning to understand the perspective of that staff member and the predicament that they're put in through the behaviour that's being displayed in front of them. So I find that can be quite effective. Praise and reinforcement. And never ever, since the training that we did, I don't think I've ever taken a guilty plea off a prisoner without thanking him for his honesty before the adjudication actually starts. Again, that's about the building the rapport, the trust, such a simple that you don't get trained on an adjudication, but actually sets the tone of that adjudication going forward and actually enables that sort of that positive interaction that you can have. Building commitment and change. So that's about helping people to understand the benefits of change and stick with this even in the face of setbacks, which is an obvious one. That's just about conversation throughout that adjudication. Some of the men that come in front of you are obviously very resistant to you trying to engage them in a positive way, because we do have difficult men. And I think what you've got to do is just be that more committed to get the best out of the process that you're putting the man through. So you just stick with it as long as you can. It does fail now and again, but you just got to try and commit to that process. Being collaborative and transparent. So this is about the tone of the adjudication, not being something that's done to somebody, but they're actually involved in the process. They're involved in why you're coming to the conclusion that you're coming to. They're allowed to have that voice that you want to give them. You paraphrase what they're saying, you repeat back to them, so they know you've listened to what they've said. I tend to, in my adjudications, I actually tend to now write down what the discussion's about, and then I'll read back to the prisoner what I've said, just to get his confirmation that actually we have a clear understanding together of why I'm coming to the conclusion that I'm coming to. And I mean, a big one for me is warmth and humour. We spoke a lot about that on the training. And does that really sit in an adjudication that's quite formal and challenging of a prisoner's behaviour? But actually, it brings so much to that process, and it can break down those formal barriers and lend itself to getting that better level of engagement. And then there's a bit about empathy and concern. So we've got one of our wings this morning locked down due to COVID, just a few positive cases. So we've got doubly vaccinated prisoners. It's lending itself to tensions and irritations, and that's now emerging in prisoner behaviours and adjudications. Well, that's a mitigating factor, and just including that and having that conversation with the prisoner about it isn't appropriate for you to speak that way, but I do actually understand that it's difficult for you as well. So it's about bringing those things into the adjudications. Some of the local stuff that I did after the training, just to sort of support local adjudicators, we've got prompts in our adjudication room on the wall just to remind the adjudicator of all these skills to try and use throughout the adjudication, just so we don't lose sight of it. Does it have any real benefits? And I mean, like I say, I've done adjudications now for about 12 years. It has absolutely massive benefits. I don't think I'm very deliberate in trying to make my adjudications as rehabilitative as I can when I do them. It takes longer to do adjudications. I've done 17 this morning, and it's actually quite demanding when you've got all the other pressures of responsibility. But it's without question worth it, and without question you get some benefit from it, as does the prisoner. But I think that's all I was going to say. So I'll take questions after that. Is that okay, Flora?
That's wonderful. Thank you very much, Phil. Yeah, we'll hold all the questions till the end, and then people will be able to fire them at different panel members. Thank you. I think it's so interesting to hear kind of your real life experience of taking a system, a process that traditionally has been about investigating and punishing, and saying, actually, the very way we interact with people during this makes a difference. There is potential here, which we perhaps haven't thought about, not only by bringing in those procedural justice principles more explicitly, but also all those skills that we know can help people to interact and think and behave differently, to provide opportunities. For anyone in the event who is interested, the full evaluation of that trial that Hindley, along with Haverig, Lancaster Farms and Style prisons took part in, is available on the Insights website. There's a blog about it, or if you just Google it, it comes up with gov.uk. So thank you very much, Phil. I'm sure there'll be more questions there will be questions for you later. But for now, I'd like to hand over to Amy Friel. So Amy's going to talk to us about procedural justice in the world of security practice. Amy.
Thanks, Flora. I'm going to attempt to share some slides now. Bear with 1 second. Okay. Can everybody see those? Yeah, lovely, some nods, fantastic. Okay, afternoon everybody. I'm Amy Friel. I'm currently the Head of Security Practice and Capability within the Risk and Capabilities Unit. Just before I do start, I will just literally 30 seconds, not to sort of bog anyone down, but just a little bit about the unit, as we are quite new and conscious that sometimes it's difficult to see sort of where we sit in the organisation, sort of understand that within context, and we have undergone some changes more recently. So the Risk and Capabilities Unit, RACU, is formed in 2020 following the merge of two existing units, Security Risk Unit and our Countermeasures Unit. So the new RACU unit sits within Operational Security Group in the new Directorate of Security, formerly SOCT, so a very recent change, so formerly Security Audit and Counterterrorism Directorate. So the purpose of our unit is to provide a dedicated team focused on identifying and prioritising security risks and providing and enhancing capabilities in prisons, probations and youth custody to counter them. Now today, although we're working on projects across lots of different areas, today I'm just going to be focusing on how we work with procedural just approaches in terms of incorporating and embedding them into our products, projects for custody, which is the remit of today's session. Again, although I'm here today talking about the work that we do, it really is a bigger team effort, and there's so many across our team. And when I say team, I'm talking about sort of the RACU team, but security colleagues within sites, the wider security directorate, evidence-based practice team, psychology services. And I think that combination of research expertise and experience in the field is really vital to what we do. So I know we've not got a lot of time today. So what I've just tried to do is to select a few of the initiatives to talk about today, specifically with regards to how PJ is embedded into our security products and processes as a key approach to ensuring that safer and more secure environment. Okay, so I'll start with our first one, which is our state of security. So this project came from the notion that all sites, governors and staff often know when they've had a good day in security, but it might be more difficult for them to break that down into the different elements and the key components of what constituted that good day. So what State of Security aims to do is to offer the site the opportunity to look beyond some of those performance measures and really understand their own security priorities and culture in an honest and a reflective way. So this allows a prison staff, all of their staff, as experts in their site to reflect on their prison's security culture rather than being overly reliant or governed by audit processes. So it's not a replacement for audit by any means, and they absolutely should complement each other. This is more that qualitative approach, and I suppose speaks very much to what Ralph mentioned at the beginning in terms of, you know, individual people might go on that journey and progress for themselves, and in the same way a site's individual state of security might look very different depending on their own needs and sort of where they're at in terms of their progress. So the State of Security offers sites the State of Security framework, which is displayed on the screen there in that wheel, and also a process model of how to use this and how to apply it at a site to assist them in being able to assess, review and monitor their security as part of a whole prison approach. And again, that's really key here. This isn't just something that security does to a site. This is, you know, a process that everybody in a site should be involved with and contribute to and see security as part of their priorities as well. So the State of Security framework that's on the screen was promoted and really sort of led by our Deputy Director, Jamie Bennett, and it outlines the 6 key elements of what make up effective security. So for us in RACU, this is a balanced and holistic and evidence-led approach to understanding security within HMPPS that goes beyond those traditional approaches to security. Now, many of the areas are quite self-explanatory and not many sort of great surprises there, but 2 of them for me, a third that I will just put a pin in terms of capability because I'll come back to that later, but 2 of them for me really draw reference to because they align to procedural justice, and procedural justice is a real sort of core concept within those. So the first being dynamic security. And this sort of really depends again on that whole prison approach, with everybody being integrated and feeling that security is part of their role. It relies on staff developing those positive prisoner staff relationships and an awareness of what's going on in their prison. That fair treatment and that sense of well-being among prisoners and staff is really central to dynamic security. Particularly difficult at times when we have low staffing levels, stress, social distancing, regime lockdowns, things like that. And during those times, deliberate efforts are really needed, and that procedural justice approaches are central to ensuring and being part of that dynamic security. The second element on there that I just want to sort of highlight is that strategic integration. So this is underpinned by how a prison's objectives align and complement each other. So this means not working in isolation, but being integrated and recognising that all areas of a prison are working towards a common goal. So we want security to be a social rather than a purely technical practice. And it's again about that safe and secure culture and utilising all areas of our work to achieve this. So strategic integration is about security being aligned with procedural justice, with rehabilitative culture, with our safety strategies, and everybody sort of working towards those common goals together. So this strategic integration again is important for sites, but equally as important for us in RACU and the Directorate of Security, in ensuring that when we create something, we're doing that in a way that supports that and is aligned with rehab culture, and that our processes are procedurally just as well. I think the examples highlighted by some of our field experts today just really speak testament to some of those. So the State of Security again just aims to ensure that procedural justice approaches are embedded within sites' responses, but also our own practice. So the framework underpins the vast majority of our work, and no matter which area of security we're focusing on at that time, that strategic integration just really aims to make sure that we're consistently aligned to an evidence-led approach and underpins that rehab culture. I could talk all day about state of security, so I won't. I promise that I won't. I'm quite close to the project, but I suppose the reason why I wanted to sort of bring it today is just to highlight the importance of procedural justice to security, and how integral it is to our state of security framework that underpins the vast majority of what we do. To highlight this a little bit further, I am just going to talk through another of our initiatives, which was the Security and Rehab Culture Sourcebook. So this was completed in 2020 and really was an absolute joy to work on. There is also a video already uploaded onto the Insights website on this, so if anybody's seen that, fantastic. But there is a hard copy or a virtual copy of a source book that can go with. So the aim of this product was to set out the relationship between rehabilitative culture and security, and it starts from the point that I suppose previously the two concepts have sometimes been perceived to sit at opposite ends of a spectrum in terms of you can have one or the other, or a dichotomy of choice. And this again comes from that traditionalist approaches or historical approaches to security. But more recent literature, as Flora spoke to earlier on, around research, speaks to the more integrated and entrepreneurial approach. And this starts from the position that it's essential that security and rehab cultures are balanced and integrated successfully. So the source book was written primarily for leaders, but it's really great for anybody really. The chapters are really interesting and are written in a way that offer concrete examples of these topic areas written by subject matter experts in terms of their application to security practice. So there's 4 main chapters that are listed on the screen there. So staff and prisoner relationships, procedural justice and security, promoting diversity and inclusion, and trauma-informed and trauma-responsive practice. So we were so fortunate to be able to have support from experts in the field on this. Obviously, Flora wrote our chapter on procedural justice and security. We had contributions from Jessica Fairburn, Georgia Barnett, Jude Kelman from Psych Services, and our own Jamie Bennett from OSG. The late Ruth Mann also was a really keen supporter of the project and the source book, and was, I suppose, forever indebted to her for her research and expertise in this area as well. To focus on Flora's chapter, and I totally appreciate you will do a better job at this than me, Flora, but it was a fantastic chapter, and really helped to describe some of the security practices were how the goal was to use PJ principles as deliberately and explicitly as possible within that security context. Again, the aim of the chapter being to help people to perceive our security practices as fair, so as to garner that trust, that respect, and that willingness to cooperate, and therefore feed into that safer and more secure environment. So Flora used promising practice from security colleagues to illustrate and demonstrate how it can be applied to our communications about various security topics, including sort of full site shutdowns for searching. There was a notice to prisoners that's shared in the handbook from HMP Hull. Individual cell searches. Home House received a SOCT award for their work on integrating procedural justice and security in that area, so for some fantastic work there. They generated some almost cue cards that staff could use to be really, again, explicit about the language that staff could use that can be discarded with time, but just a really helpful aid at the time that could be used. For prison visitors as well, so a poster from HMP Wayland is used as an example. And again, for me, I think that just really speaks to the PJ principles being able to be applied, not just as a one-way process between staff and prisoners, but also for the public, for people that are coming into a prison environment, but also staff to staff as well. You know, they're principles that we can apply in all our communications more broadly. Use of force as well, in terms of how PJ was used to inform decision making and debriefs. Drug testing, but also information sharing as well, how we can do that in a really sort of open, communicative way. So the chapter outlines the strategic integration between security and PJ perfectly, provides sites with really concrete examples to draw promising practice from across a broad range of security practices with different groups of people as well. So really sort of encourage people to have a look at the video or reach out for that source book and have a good read of that. So to finish with, I just wanted to highlight how The messaging about the alignment between procedural just approaches and security is embedded further for staff. So I've outlined almost our evidence approach and underpinning state of security framework and how PJ is integrated into that and a critical part of that. An example of how we brought that to life with Flora and the source book. I'm just going to finish how this is now an important part of our staff security capability building. So I mentioned at the beginning, I work across 2 teams within RACU, so security practice, which is our ensuring that evidence informs our security practice and decision making, but also the security capability team, which is quite a new team, who seek to enhance the confidence and competence of our security staff undertaking their duties through bespoke, tailored upskilling interventions or programmes. So what we've done is integrated procedural justice across all our programmes in terms of the links to security, and it's part of our core content for those programmes. And the alignment of PJ security is embedded into all of that bespoke upskilling. So this ensures that we can continue to support staff at all grades and get those consistent messages about procedural justice approaches and how they work together with security, make sure they're consistent but also tailored to those specific grades of staff or areas of need and specialism. So we are only just over a year old, the team, so we're ever evolving in line with sort of the needs of staff, especially after the last 18 months. So on the slide that I'm showing now, it's absolutely not exhaustive, but just some of the key projects to date. So we have done a rewrite of the operational support grade training, ensuring that PJ is incorporated and links made to key OSG tasks embedded in that and the importance of that. The prison officer apprenticeship, we've reviewed the content in there and ensured that any up-to-date products and initiatives are embedded as part of that so that staff have the appropriate information to hand. We've piloted a Heads of Security Development programme for PSP North and PSP South and procedural justice in terms of both how staff utilise that themselves as heads of security, but also how they can support their teams and other staff members is part of that core content. We have a custodial managers programme that we've piloted for those custodial managers working with enhanced gate security, and we're just coming to the end of the pilot with the open estate. The future iteration of the programme will be a generic custodial manager security training programme, but with bolt-ons for specific areas of need. But again, that core content around the importance of PJ for custodial managers working in security and who they manage will be part of that content. And then we also delivered some security awareness masterclasses with the Kent, Surrey and Sussex region. That was really sort of bespoke and tailored around their sort of security needs following the last year. But one of those areas was dynamic security, which again promoted the use of procedural just approaches and skills for staff. And again, that wasn't just security staff. So that programme was all staff across all grades, whoever was available to dial into that programme. Just a couple that are in development is a programme with our heads of function for the youth custody service, and this is for heads of security and heads of safeguarding, so it's a joint programme. Again, procedural just approaches will be core content within that, and then our basic security awareness programme, which is hopefully be an e-learning programme. Again, open for all staff, all grades, new and existing, but again, we'll have PJ approaches as some core content in terms of how that links to security. So they're the main programmes and work to date, and there are smaller bespoke asks, but that's the main programmes. I think the last 18 months, understandably, has taken its toll on everybody, and we've seen sort of the impact on staff's ability, confidence and competence to perform or carry out the duties that have not been routinely required of them or have been changed or adapted. And it's just really important that we continue to understand the needs of our staff and where possible support staff to develop. Applying PJ to security practice is one of those really important areas, especially at times of unprecedented change. So on the first slide, there is an email for the risk and capabilities unit if anybody has any broader questions outside of the scope of today. But on that note, I will hand back to yourself, Flora. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amy. Really interesting. I think two things really jump out at me. Is one, just this significant shift from a much more traditional old school approach where security stood alone, and actually the recognition that actually if this is much more integrated both into the cultures of prisons and into everybody's jobs rather than a particular department, but also bringing in other aspects of evidence, we can better do that, and in doing so we can better keep everybody safe. I think the other thing I really like is very much how your team is really walking the walk when it comes to procedural justice. This isn't something where you nod occasionally to it. Everything is now thinking about this. Every training program, every new framework, every tool is promoting this and helping people to use it. And I think that is how we end up, I suppose, in some ways, moving the cultures of our entire service when this becomes the norm. It's not an extra, it's not an add-on, it's not a when I have a bit of time. It just becomes this is how we are operating at all times. That's going to take time to achieve and huge effort, but it sounds like your team in a very short period of time has done so much work in this area. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
So I'm now going to hand over to Winston. Winston is kindly going to talk about his experience of working particularly with young people and how procedural justice has influenced his practice and hopefully some of the effects that that's had. Winston, over to you.
Thanks, Flora. Good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, my name is Winston. I'm the head of safeguarding at Warrington. We're an 118-bed unit which forms part of the youth custody estate within NOMS. So, firstly, if I can just start off by saying how I was introduced to procedural justice. I was invited, having joined Warrington after a short period, to a peace symposium, which was chaired by or hosted by Youth Custody Services, and I got to meet Flora, and to secure a true understanding of actually what procedural justice was. And I sat there during the 2-day event, and I thought to myself, well, this is actually just being a really good person. All these principles, if you're a good, honest person, then it should automatically just flow naturally. So there was $1 million question at the end of the symposium, and the question was, it was opened up to the audience: how do we actually operationalise this piece of work? So deep down inside, I knew the answer, but because I was new to youth custody, I kind of kept it to myself, and I thought, let me get back to my side, let me talk to the governor at the time, and let's see how we can kind of like operationalise what we'd learned that over those 2 days into the work that we're doing at Warrington. So just at this time, I was asked then, as I was responsible for the behaviour management strategies, to do a review of those strategies, which kind of then allowed me then to break away from what was then the normal IEP scheme. So we all know the IEP scheme, it's structured, it was, target driven, it's 7-day reviews, kind of punitive led, and we felt, that's kind of not really fit for children, especially of our age range, between 15 and 18-year-olds in custody. So in partnership with children and our staffing groups and our psychology team, we kind of created then what we now call our reward, recognition and reparation framework, which kind of allows children then to, or allows us then as operating frontline members to recognise and reward the good behaviours displayed by children, and kind of removing away some of the punitive culture. But equally then it allows children then to repair any harm that has been caused as a result of their kind of like their displaying of their behaviours. So we got this framework ready, we were up and ready to go, but what I didn't want to do, and I didn't want to be typically prison service, was to put a poster on the wall and send an email out and say this is how we're now going to change the culture. I went back to our governor at the time, and he allowed me then to rotate, as we did, 116 frontline staff members through a 1-day training course. So that training course kind of looked at behaviours in children, we looked at resource management, and equally we introduced procedural justice. So we set up a couple of role plays, and in terms of how we can be procedurally just within progression reviews with children, but then equally I did a training session in terms of then how it's like as a staff member to deliver procedural justice, but equally be exposed to it and in receipt of it. So it was an interesting 8-week journey we went on, but we got there, and we embedded and rolled out our reward, recognition and reparation framework. But then of course COVID came along and kind of wiped us all out for a bit, and the development of that. But while we're in the midst of COVID, I was kind of thinking that in terms of how then can I bring what we've learned from procedural justice and the relaunch of our behaviour management strategy, and then link that into then another big piece of work, which was following the recommendations from the Charlie Taylor review into independent review restraint of pain that apply to children in custody. So there's a lot of recommendations from that review, but there's one key principle that sticks out for me in terms of how we review kind of restraint and restraint minimisation, and that's listening to the voice of the child. So as the head of safeguarding, primarily my role is to represent the child and to represent their safety and well-being, but most importantly it is to listen to their voice and to hear what they're saying and they're telling us. But I am an advocate and a great advocate for our staffing group, and equally I think it's so important that they equally get to raise their voice and we get to listen to exactly what it is they're saying and what we can learn from those. So as part of our independent review panels, we work in partnership because we come under Safe Staffordshire. I work with a lovely lady by the name of Hazel Williamson, and she chairs once a quarter our independent review panels. So historically, prior to COVID, our meetings were quite shocking, if I'm being honest. There wasn't a team effort within there. It wasn't there was no restorative approach to it, and there seemed to be a bit of a blame culture in terms of what had gone wrong and what we could or couldn't do better as a result of restraint. Now, I know it's very easy for us to sit there and look at CCTV footage and body-worn camera footage and kind of in hindsight look at what could have been better and what could have worked differently when we're looking at restraint upon children. But Hazel and I did a big piece of work, and we got together quite often, and we thought, you know what, there's two core groups missing from these review panels, and I think we need to draw on their experiences and bring them into these meetings going forward. So the next meeting then, as passionate as I was about it, I wanted frontline officers there, and equally the children that were involved in those restraints. So just give you an overview, what normally happens is Hazel and her team would ring me up and say, okay, Winston, I'd like to look at incident pack number 1, 5, 7, 9, for example. We get all the package and the CCTV and the body worn and the use of force paperwork together, and then we'd sit there and review it. So we followed in kind of that principle, but this time we're going to have the frontline officers there that were involved in those restraints, and equally the children there that were subjected to those restraints. So a bit nervous at first when the children were involved, because it's quite daunting when 3 or 4 lads are coming into a group of 12 or 14 people. It did cost me. I had to strike some good deals with the children in order to be good and represent us as best as themselves as best as they could. But they did me proud. But what's really important for me is the fact that they actually got to hear. We got to hear their voice and the voice of the staffing groups. So it has changed the culture for us at Warrington. We learn from our mistakes equally, especially during restraint and incident management stuff, but we can only learn from those mistakes when we're involving, as I say, the children that we're here to care for and the staffing groups that we work for. So we have been on a journey. It has been mentioned COVID has kind of impacted on a lot of the work that we've done, and we still have a way to go. And I do strongly believe that there are other avenues and ways in which we can embed the principles of procedural justice in other areas that we do. So going back to what I said earlier, I think if you're a good-hearted person and you care about people in the manner in which we do, in the roles that we do, I think naturally it does flow. But I think we have still got a journey to do in kind of upskilling our staffing teams in terms of how that looks. So just going back to our reviewing panels, just looking at the 4 principles, we conduct our review meetings now in the chapel. So it's a neutral and open space. It's warm. We've got a good feel in there. We set the boundaries in terms of what we're going to be reviewing, and we set the boundaries in terms of how we're going to respect each other going through. Everybody's going to have their own different views and opinions in terms of what restraint looks like and how that could be managed, but equally we set the boundary in terms of let's be respectful and let's listen to the voice and opinions of others. Again, the voice, the children have done me proud in probably the 6 or 7 panels that we've done. They're all independent. They all come from a cross section of our population. So it's quite comforting to hear that in general, they don't think we like to do restraint as good practice. They do see it as a last resort, as opposed to just the first option to maintain control and stuff. But equally, on top of that, then the bit that kind of touches my heart is the trust that comes from that, because I'd like to think then that they all trust me in the position that I hold, alongside with the other SLT members, that we can make the changes that are needed in order to kind of reduce the levels of restraint that are used on children in custody. So I didn't want to kind of overburden what we've done, because there's a lot of work. There's been some similar themes that have been presented across the other speakers that you've heard today. But as I say, being good people that we are, it comes very easy, but you know what, we still are on a bit of a journey, and we want the best. So yeah, thank you, Flora.
Thank you very much, Winston. You talk with such passion about this, and which you know, it takes, doesn't it? I mean, the work that we do, and no matter what the roles are, can be difficult and hard. And I think keeping that passion for how can we do it as well, and how can we do this and be good to people around us is so important. I like the fact that there's sort of two approaches. You've done the kind of training of staff as a general group to try and kind of bring this to people's awareness, and obviously there'll be sort of work a way to go, but then really honing in on some particular practices which might be the cause of real conflict or mistrust and grievance, you know, restraint, the serious events for both the staff doing them as well as the young people. I think it's such a lovely idea that by bringing greater transparency and procedural justice, it enables better learning, because people can talk about and hear about how has this been experienced and how do we learn. It's a very brave step though, isn't it? Because it can be difficult, isn't it, when you think, actually, if this is going to be open to more discussion, am I going to be held to accountable? Am people going to say things about me? It's quite hard to move from that blame culture to one where people feel comfortable just to talk and learn. It sounds like that's been a really big part of the last few years at Warrington.
Yeah, it was the biggest change was for people to accept that it was okay for children to have a voice, especially where they've been restrained, but equally where, you know, the child was there and the 2 officers or 3 officers that had restrained him were actually brought together in a room together, where in front of a group of people that they, you know, sometimes they didn't even know, let's discuss this incident and let's be open and honest about it. So initially it was a challenge, but it's the norm now for us, which is good. So
lovely. Well, thank you very much for sharing that with us all. So we've now heard from all our panelists and a bit from me, and we're now moving into the question and answer part of the event. My lovely colleague, Dr. Helen Wakeling, is helping to field this. So Helen works in the evidence team with me and has been heavily involved in procedural justice work as well. She and I collaborated on the rehabilitative adjudications pilot, which we heard Phil talk about recently. And I'm hoping, although I'm not sure if she quite knows it yet, that she will host one of the upcoming procedural justice online events that will focus on staff, because she led the research around that for officers and other colleagues throughout prisons in this country. So Helen, passing over to you, will you give us a question?
Yes, hi everybody, and thank you, Flora. Thanks everyone for your questions. There's some really great questions coming through on the chat. And I hopefully we will have time for them all, but just to remind people, if we don't, we will send out a Q&A document to everybody. Okay, so the first question that's come through is for Ralph, and it's from Kate Rose, who says she really likes the values and principles of being kind, fair and honest. But how have you embedded this in both the men and the staff?
Yeah, it's a really good point. So I'm fortunate enough to be working with Dr. Sarah Lewis, who runs the growth project with us, which has been run at Guy's Marsh previously, and a few prisons have got Sarah in now and her team doing work around that. So the values actually came from an exercise that we did with Sarah came in and interviewed 250 staff in groups over 2 weeks, and out of that came some really clear feedback, which was actually quite a difficult read, because as I said, Huel had not been in a great place for some time. But key in that was all the principles that we've talked about, and this links to another question around staff and how we treat our staff. All the feedback through that, really, a lot of it was threaded within that was concepts around fairness, legitimacy, care, kindness, compassion, and so really we took that as a as a template, I guess, to then start to put some of that, allow staff to be empowered to actually start to influence some of that themselves. I'm a big believer in bottom-up management rather than top-down. You know, if I can get all my staff working and feeling empowered and valued to be able to do this sort of thing, that's far more powerful than me dictating to them that I want them to do it. But it started really with us actually taking a hard look at ourselves as a management team and understanding what were we doing. Was that in creating a culture where staff felt that they were being treated fairly? And then from that, what we found is as we started to work through some of that and make the staff feel valued and treated fairly and with kindness and compassion, they then were able to then reflect that into their relationships with our prisoners. So it really started off with that. And then this whole, the growth project is all about people, prisoners in growth groups and staff in growth groups, actually identifying issues that are important to them. Many of them linked to procedural justice. So, for example, at the moment, we've got a growth group working on what's our IEP going to look like, which is a classic procedurally unjust process, generally, unfortunately. So taking those things that are important to them, being empowered to actually get on and find the solutions, because I tend to find if there's a problem and I ask the staff who are actually dealing with it and ask the prisoners who are affected by it, generally they'll have the answer. So then it's about just empowering them and saying, okay, that's what you think the answer is, let's do that. And I've talked before about sort of the power of saying yes. And I talked about that with some of the Unlock grads. And actually, if somebody comes up with a solution, if somebody has an idea or a way in which they think something can be done better, again, coming back to the idea of voice and me setting out that my motives for this are that we all move forward together, that the prison is going to be a better place for all of us. And that if they've got an idea for how they're going to make that happen, well, I think it's a pretty easy job for me to say, yeah, go ahead and do that. And then support them and give them the cover they need to go away and make those decisions and do what they think is the right thing to try and move things forward. So it wasn't a big training package. It wasn't we didn't do a big communications campaign. We sort of did it in terms of changing culture around listening and understanding, and then actually really importantly giving people the autonomy and empowering them to be involved in the solution themselves rather than it becoming I'll give you one example. I really dislike "you said we did," and the reason I really dislike "you said we did" is because it implies that somehow people will tell me and the senior team the problem and we will then fix it. Well, actually, that I don't think is the way you solve problems most effectively, nor is it the way you change culture. What it should be is "we said we did," because we're all actually involved in the solution rather than it being me or the team or the senior team making those things happen. Because I've got some amazing staff with some amazing ideas. What they needed was the opportunity to actually put some of that into action. And I've generally found that without me really having to push concepts of procedural justice or fairness or honesty or kindness, because that's the values that are inherent in most of my staff, which came through in that piece of work where we were talking to them and listening to them, that's what was important to them. That's what they valued. So as long as they felt treated like that and they were working in line with their values, that then has translated into their relationships with our prisoners, and then who then feel able to be involved themselves and get involved with something like the growth project where they're actually valued and engaged and empowered to do some of the solutions themselves as well. So hopefully that answers that question, but that's how we've done it.
Thank you, Ralph. I think that certainly answers that question, and the following one about buy-in and the relationship between how staff feel treated and then how then they interact with the residents in their care. That's certainly something Flora and I have found in our research, that the more procedurally just staff feel they are treated, the more they are able to use procedural justice principles in how they treat the residents in their care. Okay, moving on. There is a question for Phil about adjudications. It's about when you thank people for being honest. There's a question about, would you thank for a not guilty plea, as that could also be honest?
I guess that's a bit of a personal question on how I conduct adjudications, and I haven't developed that habit. No, so no, I don't do that. No, to answer the question.
Okay.
I don't know if I can give you. I know it's a lot shorter than Ralph's answer, but I'm not sure how I elaborate on that. But no, I don't.
That's fine. Thank you. Perhaps a wider question is around PJ training. So Susie has asked, is there PJ training widely available for prison staff to attend? I'm not sure who's best to answer that. Flora, do you want to start? Or?
Should I start with that one? So I think there's been various iterations of this and availability. Generally speaking, workshops and training around procedural justice tend to be delivered in response to particular requests by groups of staff and then tailored for their particular needs. So an individual prison, for example, might come to me and say, look, will you come in and run some sessions with us that we can spend time thinking about not only what this is and how we can use it, but particularly using it for our site, for our colleagues. So there isn't a sort of national package, so to speak. We are really supportive of individual sites or regions developing their own kind of packages, making this real for them. So I know of quite a lot of CMs and psychologists in prisons over the country who have developed local packages and local ways of developing that, where they feel it's kind of delivered by people they know and trust, and that seems to work. There's also ways where we're building it into existing training, so training that's about a particular process. So take the adjudications training. There's a big review going on at the moment, and when the training that's rolled out as standard for adjudicating governors and adjudication liaison officers, for example, the new package will include procedural justice, with the expectation you don't just learn how to do the steps of an adjudication, you learn how to do it in a rehabilitative way, like how Phil was explaining. That will become the norm. So yes, so there are different ways of accessing this kind of training, but there is no standard template, because we've taken the approach of trying to make this more tailored and individually relevant. That of course has the downside that it's perhaps not as easy to access, and something I'm definitely thinking more about as we go forward. I can see Ralph has his hand up, so Ralph, I hope you're going to come in and say something brilliant.
I don't know about brilliant, Flora, but we're doing a training program in the West Midlands for custodial managers, and one of the parts of that is procedural justice. So, and I think that's a good example of where we've had support for that from within the rehab culture team, actually, to help us deliver that. So, you know, I've found you guys to be incredibly supportive, and we wanted to do something, you know, just ask, and actually there'll be something. That's just the form of a presentation and then some sort of discussions and forum work, but actually takes an hour and a half, and it's really powerful, and the CMs that have done it in the West Mids have taken a lot away from it. I think also training is really hard to get delivered. You know, we've all got massive training burdens, and I just think one of the things, just a reflection on one of the really simple things we did at Cure, all we started doing was asking why. So we started asking why things happened. And by asking why, instead of just focusing on what happened, is asking why. So it kind of goes back to that point about not the outcome, but the how did you get there. By also asking why a lot. Those of you that work in prisons or with teams where you want to embed this, just asking why, people tend to know a lot more than you see on a daily briefing sheet. And by then asking why something happened, often what you find is that there is an understanding of why. And then you can start to actually say, well, what are we doing about the why? We may have placed them on report, put it on IRS and all the rest of it, but what are we actually doing about understanding why that person did that thing? And what comes out of that then is a much more procedurally just conversation about, well, actually, what are we going to do with that? Because once you've confronted the why, the next question is, well, okay, so what are we going to do with it? So that's just a personal reflection, but in a very crowded training schedule, it's hard to think, how do you train 500 staff to all do procedural justice? But there are some really simple ways you can sort of thread it through what you do, and asking why and then focusing on how do we then do something about that is a really simple way of doing it, I've found.
Amy, do you want to come in as well?
Yeah, just from a promising practice perspective, I think it would be really helpful, Ralph, for either us to have a chat or for you to point me in the direction of who's sort of leading that CM training. I think it'd be really interesting to sort of hear about how that's gone, the content and stuff to align. I think that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem, Amy.
There are a couple more questions for you, Ralph. One of them you've already answered in the chat, but I think it might be worthwhile to talk about it as well. So Richard Moore has asked, does Huel have a local PJ strategy paper that could be shared, or is this something you expect to see weaving into all of your prison strategies?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So we don't fess up, we don't have a rehab culture strategy, nor do we have a PJ strategy at Huel, but that's because we've chosen to thread it through everything that we're doing. And one of the key strategies for that, as I've said in my answer, is our well-being strategy. So we're combining well-being and safety into one function. So it'll be a safety and well-being function. And I've got a band 7 head of well-being as well as a band 7 head of safety within that function. And so that strategy, whilst it will contain annexes that are all the things that we have to do, so Act version 6, CSIP, all those mandatory sort of things that we need to recognise, overarching that will be a well-being strategy. And within that will be very clearly some of the elements around rehabilitative culture, including procedural justice. Also, I mentioned earlier about our employment pathways and our pay structure and our progression pathways and the work that we're doing through early days to do really effective planning of what's going to happen with an individual while they're at Huel, involving them. So I'm not going to flag that as this is procedural justice, but obviously within our reduce and reoffending strategy, we will have very clearly set out, woven into it, that we will be working with the prisoner right from the time they come into custody to formulate a plan based on what we've identified are their needs, so we can share with them what's going to happen with them, so that they're engaged and involved with that and understand what's going on to them, and really importantly, why. And then what's going to happen at the end of that, what's our part of the bargain with them, we're going to give them for the in reward and recognition of their engagement with us on their own sort of progression plan. So it is going to be woven right the way through. We're only going to have 4 strategies: people strategy, local security strategy, a well-being strategy, and a reduce and reoffending strategy. And procedural justice will be embedded in all of them. And security colleagues will be pleased to know that's going to be a feature in our LSS. Will be, where can we get it, even into the LSS? How can you get procedural justice in terms of things like searching, closed visits, all of those things that are such big decisions for prisoners? How do we do that in a more procedurally just way? So threaded throughout.
Thank you very much. There's one more question specifically about Huel, Ralph. I'm sorry for putting you on the spot for so many questions in a row. But how have you begun to evidence staff displaying a caring approach?
Yeah, so some of this at the moment is really anecdotal. So it's just basically leadership by conversations is what I talk about a lot. So get out and about, talk to people, look at what's happening on the wings, understand what's happening on house blocks. And certainly just from doing that, I've seen enormous changes around what are the conversations that people are having. So there is an element of it that at the moment is anecdotal. We are evaluating the growth project. So, and obviously within that is threaded this whole concept of allowing people to grow, recognising individuals, all the things I talked about earlier. So that evaluation should pull some of that in. We're also looking at early days, but I'm looking at setting up a metric around well-being. So just some really simple questions, probably linking in with the sort of stuff that MQPL do. So that as well as measuring some of those hard outcomes that I mentioned earlier, like violence and self-harm, and a lot goes into them, and actually that, you know, almost they're measurements of the failures to some extent, if that makes sense. Actually, I'd really like to understand, for those that aren't using violence or self-harm, are they still getting better, to put it really simply? And so that, hopefully, that well-being metric based on some simple questions that we'll then revisit at different times during that prisoner's time with us, should start to show us whether they are improving their own personal well-being while in Hull. And I think we could probably correlate that with how effectively are we caring for people. If their well-being's improving, I think it would evidence that there was therefore more care, and we were caring more and better in order to then improve their well-being. Because I think if they're in an environment where we didn't care, I don't think you'd see their well-being improve. So nothing specific, but some measures there that we're looking at that hopefully will give us a better understanding of what's happening, and actually really importantly, what's working. What are the things that we're doing that are making a real difference?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, isn't it, about how we measure the things we're doing and how we know that they're having an impact. So that evaluation is really key, isn't it, for all of this work. Thank you, Ralph. The next question is more general, and it may be one for Winston or Amy, potentially. Has the PJ approach also been linked to the importance of neurodiversity? Does anyone feel able to answer that?
I'm thinking. Read it. Can you read it again for us, Helen?
Yeah, of course. Has the PJ approach also been linked to the importance of neurodiversity?
Ooh, probably one for Flora. Just going to bat that right.
I'm struggling, if I'm honest.
I imagine it would be, if, you know, in terms of thinking about sort of specific learning needs. I imagine having those elements built into your communications absolutely would support a range of learning needs. I'm not specifically aware of any sort of research on that per se, but I only feel like sort of the evidence behind PJ would support those approaches as well.
Yeah, I think I'm in complete agreement with that, Amy. I don't think anything has been done, but it's an area we should probably focus more on.
Yes, I quite agree. I think there's a few things to consider in terms of not only, like I said, that really clear communication. I've spoken with, for example, a CM at Moreland who talked about concerns around, you know, how complicated and how many prison rules there are. And, you know, if you ask most staff to list off all the prison rules, I'd be surprised if anyone could. And they're written in jargon and a kind of very legalistic language. Well, if even that is complicated, then, you know, is it quite fair to then hold people accountable to something that maybe is quite confusing and possibly not easy to remember? So is there a role where we can think about procedural justice in terms of our trustworthy motives and respect and neutrality in explaining rules and talking about rules in a much clearer way, and recognizing that for some people remembering that is going to be quite difficult, and therefore breaching a rule might not be a case of some kind of willful act, and often we know misconduct is not necessarily an active choice but influenced by a whole range of factors. But is it something about recall, in which case that's something we need to be helping people with, to put them in a better position of being able to remember those rules. I mean, I'm thinking in this case, particularly in the case of someone with learning difficulties or challenges, and the difficulty with, you know, translating knowledge or rules from one context to another. So actually that's not as easy to know certain rules on the wing, how that translates to rules in the workshop, for example. So in that case, yes, I think there is definitely a link here. But to reiterate what Helen and Amy said, I'm not aware of any specific research that has looked at PJ and neurodiversity.
Amy, do you want to come back in?
I think Ralph might have had his hand up first.
Okay, go Ralph.
It's fine, you probably heard enough from me, but I think it's a brilliant question, because it's one of the things that through the wellbeing pathway work we've done, we've created a wellbeing unit, and also our Oak unit, which is very much focused on those with the most significant needs. And actually articulating that the outcome from an act of behaviour for one person will be very different to another, or progression for one person may look very different to progression for another, based on their own individual needs, was something that we were really conscious of trying to make sure we got right, because otherwise actually you can end up with perceptions of unfairness. So why is that person not being placed on report and not being put in the SEG, when that person is being placed on report and potentially being put in the seg, and the actual behaviour itself was the same. Well, that's because actually for that individual, their understanding of the rules and their comprehension of the rules and their ability to comply and interact with them, like you said, Flora, is completely different from that chap there. So we do have different expectations of you, but starting and explaining that at the start by focusing on the individual and who they are and what their needs are allows you to then actually be able to do that in a fair and equitable way. And actually our prisoners have really accepted that. We had an assault on the Oak unit where one of our men walked out of his cell and punched the cleaner, just walked up to him and punched him in the face. Now the guy had some really serious issues and was really struggling. And actually we did some work with the cleaner to explain to him why we weren't going to put that man in the segregation unit. We weren't going to take punitive action against him. And we explained why that was the right thing to do. And he totally accepted that and has actually then built a reasonably positive relationship with the chap who actually punched him in the face a few days earlier. But so it's about the person. But I think it's a really good question. And sometimes we have a one-size-fits-all approach in prisons, and it just doesn't work because it doesn't understand and recognise the different individuals we're working with.
Absolutely. Amy, did you want to join in?
Just to sort of again reiterate what people have said, but just to add the importance of that voice element again to this group as well. So being able to sort of communicate their understanding in a way that's appropriate to them can only sort of help us understand you know, their thinking, or you know what the particular issue is that can then guide decision making from there as well. So I think voice for, you know, neurodiversity, I think is so important to be able to sort of often give that voice where it's often not heard or often misunderstood, and being able to sort of listen to it and properly understand so that we can tailor and adapt to the needs.
Thank you. Flora?
Yes, sorry, I know you're going to move on to the next question, but I just want to follow up what Amy was saying, and I think it's conversations I've been hearing a lot of people recently when it comes to consultation. Often I think historically we've thought about consultation with lots of varied groups and making sure that's representative, but what I'm also hearing, which is lovely, more recently, is that actually the very method of consultation may need to be different. Some people don't want to sit in a room being told, here's your chance to speak, and that doesn't feel comfortable with them. Some people want to do it by writing. Some people don't have those literary skills and would rather do it in a key work session. So I think it's not just making sure we hear everybody's voices, but we provide the options for voice in ways that they actually do want to use. So yes, I'm going, off you go, Helen, next question.
Yes, good point. Okay, the next question is around prison POMs. So how would you encourage prison POMs to incorporate PJ into their working practice when the vast majority still hold quite punitive views? I don't know who wants to take that one.
Good question.
Yes, it is.
I don't mind starting on that because obviously I've got some direct experience of that, I suppose. It is quite difficult, actually, but we've implemented supervision with our POMs. So they get supervision in the same way that our probation POMs do. So my SOs in old speak, they get supervision as well, which gives them a chance to do some reflective practice work. They also deliver our maturity toolkit and choices and changes work, which obviously has sort of elements of PJ and threaded through it in terms of dealing with the individual and working with them on their issues. So for young adults, that works quite well. But yeah, I think involving them in so there's a lot of work we do around multidisciplinary teams, meetings and multidisciplinary planning. And I think there's something about exposing POMs to other areas where perhaps the focus on, I guess, procedural justice, but also, again, coming back to my point earlier about understanding the person and what's the right thing for that individual, that's a really good way of doing it as well. And I know that can be difficult because sometimes they're not that keen to engage, but by getting them to engage with probation, with mental health, with substance misuse, they get a much more holistic view of that person. And I think are then much more likely to then treat them in a procedurally just way, as well as, I guess, a more rehabilitative way as well. So I think there's no silver bullet there, but that's a few of the things I guess I can reflect on off the hoof.
sadly, Phil's connection at Hindley has, I think, completely dropped. He's struggling because I thought he might have want to come in there, but I don't know whether Winston or Amy have anything else they want to add in Phil's absence.
Nothing specific from me in terms of, I think it would have to be quite a holistic approach. I don't think there's any one thing that would, fix that in terms of thinking about, that broader understanding around sort of culture, the purposes, staff selection for those roles, sort of training, many things could sort of feed into that understanding and then application to that post.
Thank you. The next question is around restorative practices, maybe one for you, Flora. How do restorative practices sit with PJ?
Interesting question. Yeah, so there is a really nice link between this. So if you look at the evidence around restorative justice, so for anyone not familiar, this is an approach usually taken with where conferences or interactions are held between someone who has done harm to another and the person who is harmed to talk through that and reach kind of resolution. So although the term RJ and PJ sound similar, they are in fact quite different things. However, taking a restorative approach where a person has the chance, two people, someone who's been harmed and the person who has done the harm, have a chance to talk through, hear each other's experiences and together reach some kind of resolution or agreement in sort of how that harm can be repaired or amends can begin to be made. There is a really good evidence base for specific types of that type of activity. And one of the reasons it is thought that that has the potential to have such an effect on people's behaviour, including future crime, is because the very process itself is thought to be perceived as more procedurally just, where someone, instead of being punished solely, they have a chance to talk that through, to have a conversation, to be listened to understand what the purpose of this is, and that when perhaps some of that resolution may be agreed to be punitive, that is really understood as being a fair decision to be made and the process itself is procedurally just. So I think there is within our prisons, there's a real potential for the role and significance of making reparations as being very useful for building relationships, for helping people to give back, to this not simply being we punish behaviour over and over. I think we need to be quite careful though, because if we get ourselves to a position where people are forced into making reparations, that is not quite the same thing as people actively choosing to be a part of it. And I think we could risk the potential value of reparations and being restorative becoming in fact punitive. So I think there's great potential. It does link with PJ, but we've got to be careful we don't lose the potential impact by misusing this.
Great, thank you. I've got a question now for Winston. There's a number of people saying they're really interested in the approach taken. And Gemma asks if this would help in prisons with high rates of use of force. And one thing she wasn't clear on was which children were attending the review. And if it was an independent group, how does this influence protecting confidentiality and GDPR?
Okay, so can you repeat the first part of the question for me again, sorry?
The first part is she wonders if this would help in prisons with high rates of use of force.
So yeah, we unfortunately at Wellington we are experiencing a high amount of use of force, and there's contributory factors as to why that's happening at the minute. A lot of it's external gang related, but equally it's conflict that's been generated through children in custody. So when we talk about in terms of how we select those incidents, we try and make it as diverse as possible. We'd like all lads to be represented based on all our protective characteristics equally. So yeah, the general panel of the review groups are, you know, generally social workers and frontline teams that generally work with children out in the community anyway. So youth offending teams, head of services for youth offending, our Bernardo's advocacy team. So they all work closely with children, whether it be in custody or out in the community.
And thank you, Winston. And the children attending the review,
Yeah.
are those the people involved in the restraint or others?
Yes. So again, we have to do a bit of sensitive work with these children. So the independent panel will select the incidents they like to screen. That keeps it independent. I wouldn't want them to think that I'm just kind of showing the good or the bad. And then once that's been, once they've selected those, then what I'll do is then go and speak to the children and give them the opportunity then to be a part of the kind of debrief of that incident and sell it in a way that it's in a child-friendly approach. So some children decline because the fear of walking into a large group of 10 or 15 panel members, but equally through a good relationship that I have with 99% of them, that they trust me to be able to come up and I'll support them if need be. Our lads, they're very open, they're very honest, and they're strong members, so they're more than happy to come and share their experiences, and as I said earlier, they do very, very well.
Thank you very much, Winston. There's another question for Ralph. What do you think is currently the biggest barrier to being procedurally just around incentives?
Okay, I think, well, holistically, the problem with IEP, for example, is that it's been used in a punitive way, largely. So it wasn't supposed to be, that wasn't how it was designed. But in simple terms, we know that we are more in prisons. It's more likely to be a negative act is far more likely to be recorded than a positive act. So immediately you've got there a procedurally unjust system, because you can have a guy who's been really good, really engaged, been behaving really well with no entries on their nomis, and then they'll do one thing wrong and that will be on there. And then they've got their one negative entry. And I think that's culturally something we need to work through. And we haven't got that right at Huel. I'm really relieved we're not having to really use IEP at the moment, because we're not ready to use it right. And that's why we're building it from bottom up as best we can to try and make it reflect what we're doing at Huel. I do think that there are elements in there where almost it becomes procedurally unjust in and of because of the things that we're removing. Because if you think about what our motivations are, we say our motivation is to rehabilitate, we say our motivation is to create change, and then for people at the time when they perhaps most need that input, we remove the things that are best placed to enable them to change. Classic example being visits, also televisions. We take away the things that they rely on in order to maintain some sort of stability or progression, and then expect them to still progress. And so in terms of trustworthy motives, if I was a prisoner, I'd be saying, well, you want me to be better and change. Yes, I've done this thing wrong, but now you're taking away the things from me that are the only things that are giving me a cat in hell's chance of actually progressing, i.e. contact with my family. Or we take away their access to funds, which mean that they then we're almost imposing a debt on them, because actually how else are they going to get the things that they need? Yeah, and so there's a massive issue there for me in terms of what we say our motivations are, and then what actually we do in terms of IEP that very often is in conflict. And so for staff and prisoners, they know that. And so for staff, it becomes, well, this is punitive because actually I'm taking things away. And for prisoners, it creates a disconnect in terms of what we say we're all about. Even if we do it fairly, to be honest, actually, why are we doing it? If we really want that person to progress and change and improve. I hope that kind of answers that question.
Yeah, I think it has. And a small other question related, is there a practical process change that would make a big difference, do you think?
Yeah, make it far more explicit that it isn't punitive. So, there is a baseline that we need to set, that is the baseline that somebody should have, because we know they are the things that will contribute to their rehabilitation. And that's what we're doing. But there should always be consequences to actions, but I would look at it much more in a value added way. So if you don't do this, you're not going to ever get access to that. We're not going to take away the things that are most important to you. So you've still got a chance of progressing and rehabilitating, but we are going to give you a chance to access additional things that are going to make your life and well-being better if you're willing to engage with us. And I think starting there, so it becomes non-punitive, purely incentives based, I think that would be where to start. And I recognise there's lots of issues around that in terms of, you know, political will and all the rest of it, and I get that. But I just think there's something there about starting, where's that baseline, and then actually, yeah, brilliant, give people a chance to build on that. But really importantly, going back to my earlier point, make that individualized for that person, allow the discretion for really small things to give people access to large rewards if that small thing is what that person's a massive thing for that person. So Mr. Smith coming down for his dinner, if that's the thing that is the biggest achievement he's ever going to make in the 3 months he's at Huel, well, I want to give him his enhanced for that, because actually he can't do any better than that. He's done the best he possibly can. That's amazing that he's done that. He's never done that in his entire life. He just stays in his cell. If he does that, brilliant. Let's reward that. So the flexibility to have an individualized approach based on an individualized plan, and then recognize progression against that, and try and make that all about setting a baseline and then building on that, rather than it being, you know, taking things away that we know are so important. Why do we do that?
Thank you, Ralph. There's another question for both Winston and Ralph, which is from Kevin Bird. In your experience of enabling people to adopt PJ as a normal way of interacting and communicating, is there a particular group that you have found most challenging to get positive engagement from, and how did you overcome this? That's a great question.
Go for it, Winston.
In terms of groups, so if we've split them between children and staffing groups, I would say it was the most challenging group was, if I'm being honest, was our first line managers, our custodial managers. I think they're the most, what's the word I'm looking for? We don't invest enough time or kind of development into that group, I believe. So they were the hardest I felt. And I think just based on what Ralph was saying previously, you know, those staff members that have been in service a long time who've only known the likes of the IEP scheme, where it has been more punitive, that was quite a hard, difficult change or culture change that I've experienced in the delivery of, or the embedding of, the reward, recognition and reparation framework. That'd be me. And I think we're quite fortunate in youth custody because we do have a slightly different approach as well compared to our partners in like the adult estate or the female estate, because we are more child focused, but we still have very few staff members that are still, you know, authoritarian and so what I'm looking for, punitive driven. When we're trying to change that approach, it has made it it has been difficult. Or yours, Ralph?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think I couldn't pick out a specific group, but as Winston says, there are elements of all groups where it's an issue. So I couldn't, and that. Oh, sorry, hold on. Am I back? Yeah, sorry, something weird happened. So there's elements of lots of different areas of staff where it's an issue, and not in some instances staff who've been in a long time, but actually in some instances newer staff who've come in with a preconception of what the role is actually, and not been quite on board with what we would want them to be. So I think what I would look at it slightly from the other direction. You will have staff who absolutely get this completely. They get it. And so what happened when we opened our wellbeing unit, which had to have a different approach because they were dealing with some incredibly challenging guys who basically only ever been in the SEG. And so, you know, our approach to them had basically been, they've arrived in reception, oh God, he's back, he's in the SEG within half an hour and then stays there for 6 months. You know, it was those sort of prisoners that we will all know about. Actually, what we did was we asked people if they wanted to work on a wing where we were doing things slightly differently and we were going to generate a different culture, and we did an expressions of interest, and we gave staff the chance to put their hands up and say, I want to work on there. And then we interviewed them, even though it was just band 3 work, in effect, band 3 officer work. So what happened then was we had a team that were absolutely role modeling this behaviour, who were absolutely got it and were doing all of the good behaviours around procedural justice, rehabilitative culture. And that, what was really interesting from that was that other house blocks started then looking at what they were doing, because it was generating really positive outcomes with really difficult guys, and they started to share their learning. And so that then spread to other house blocks. And we've probably got one house block at the moment where we're still working through some issues, whether it's related to PJ or capability or competency. We're still working through that. So it's not, again, we're not the finished article by any means, but we have seen real outcomes from celebrating those that really get it. And then that pulls up the middle ground, who perhaps are a bit ambiguous to it, pulls them into the good space. And then you get your outliers who might never get it, to be perfectly honest. But then we can work on them, and actually they'll start to feel a bit isolated. And once they start to feel a bit isolated, then they'll think, oh, probably easier if I just get on board with the program here, because actually I'm starting to look a bit ridiculous with my attitude when everybody around me is doing things differently. So that would be an answer from a slightly different angle.
I wondered actually whether, Amy, I wonder whether you've come across anything of finding it difficult to convince people that procedural justice and security belong together. Traditionally, there's been a very security separate, security is not explained. I now think back with shame at my time working in prisons, where I must have used the phrase security says and never explained. And I'm wondering whether, because we've historically had a very different approach, no questions, no information to security, has there been an issue trying to convince anyone that actually there's a reason and an argument for us to do things a bit differently?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think the some of the rationale behind the state of security and starting to think about our security culture was definitely around that move from the traditionalist sort of security working in a silo, not being able to share any of their information, and really trying to move away from that. And like I mentioned earlier, sort of, security being a social process whereby everybody's working together to that same agenda, and that was really sort of the foundations to the state of security. I think, like Ralph mentioned, I think there will always be pockets of people across maybe different areas where that's maybe not necessarily as bought into as possible, but I think just continuing to chip away at that across different areas of the business. I think hopefully that message sort of spreads via osmosis, and like you said, some people absolutely will pick up and run with this, and will have been the news. People wanted to hear about sort of security in terms of that. Other people possibly, maybe not, but sometimes a slower burn, I think, but hopefully by sort of sharing that positive practice, by having that strength base, showing sort of the initiatives that people do, because there's some absolutely fantastic work that sites are doing that really sort of embody and promote that joint up approach, and it's sharing that, I think, and sort of showing people how they can do the same, and really get on board with that.
Is using a little bit of a social norms effects and critical mass potentially. Yes. Helen, back to you.
Thank you. I'm just scrolling through the questions to see if I've missed any. There was a point about procedural justice being really important in probation as well. Now, this session is specifically about prison, but it definitely is important in probation as well. I think you'd all agree with that.
And actually on that, when we bring it to a close, I was going to talk about how in the follow-up email there's an opportunity for feedback. But if I may ask a personal plea, that if you have ideas for particular themes for future procedural justice events, please let us know. And in my mind at the moment, and this is very much in my head rather than planned, I think that it could be good to talk about PJ and communications. We talk about PJ and staff, PJ and probation, but there might be lots of others. And so if you are filling out that feedback sheet and you have particular ideas, please do say we'd really like to use those to shape future event ideas.
Great, thank you. I've just noticed, Ralph, you've answered a question in the chat about should negative entries be removed. I missed that one. And you've said yes within consistent parameters.
Yeah, just I think it's a really good point. And yeah, I think replying to the IEP stuff, yes, I would be really positive. to do that, but you just need to be consistent. Because I guess with all of the things I've talked about, you've got elements of discretion there, which is great. And you want people to feel empowered and have discretion to make decisions. You've just got to be careful that that's done in the right way. Otherwise, you could generate more unfairness rather than less unfairness. So that's why I said about the parameters. If we were going to do that, you would need to make sure, because of the significant impact of negative entries, you'd have to make sure it was really clear, because there would be a real drive from prisoners to be saying to staff, well, have I done enough to get my negative entry off? Has my negative entry come off? So you need, the consistency and the communication around it, and the governance of it, I guess, would need to be right, because it is important that negative behaviour is reflected, because actually otherwise we're not probably effectively understanding and assessing risk as well. So there's something in there where my instinctive answer is yes, but it would need to be explored as to how you did that safely and consistently, so that you weren't ignoring issues around risk and creating more unfairness, I guess.
Thank you. I think Laurie in the audience might have had a hand up. Did you want to ask a question? No, it might have gone down now. Okay, I think that is all of the questions in the chat. Thank you for submitting all of those great questions. I think you'll all agree they were really good and inspired a good amount of conversation, so that's great. Shall I pass back to you now, Flora?
Thank you very much, Helen. So I think just a few things before we end. Firstly, thank you so much for joining. I really hope it's been useful and interesting hearing from the perspectives of colleagues in doing quite different work about how this reasonably simple and somewhat sort of common sense concept actually in practice is not always so common sense, is not always so easy, but can be used to really important effects, whether it's from taking traditional processes like security and rethinking, actually, how do we do these in a world where we've got evidence about how we can do this in a much more effective, much more integrated way. But that takes quite a different approach of thinking about something that we've always seen and worked with in a different way. To, as you said, to what we're hearing about, how do we work with and engage young people in processes that have real consequences like restraint? How do we make sure that they are genuinely heard, and that in turn is done in a safe space that enables us to learn and get better at what we're doing? To dealing with how do we take an individualized approach, use procedural justice to truly see an individual, and with that, what that takes about how we might then want to rethink some of the decisions about who does what, when things happen, what we recognize, to not only be more procedurally just, but really, I guess, walk the walk when we say we see you as individuals and we want to do some good, rather than seeing people maybe as a prison number and simply locking them up. And similarly and I think Phil possibly can't hear us, but again, taking processes like adjudications, which traditionally have been quite punitive, and saying, actually, is there more potential? No one's saying there shouldn't be consequences, but actually, if we're doing this, what about doing more of what we know can engage people, get people to trust us and actually work with us, so that we're all heading in the same direction of people having the opportunity to make different choices and live different lives. So I am so grateful to my wonderful panel, thank you, and to Helen, thank you very much for dealing with all the questions. You will receive an email in due course, which will have a link to the recording of this event. Please know that that is a raw recording. In time, an accessible version with subtitles will be added to My Learning, and so accessible for those on the call who are within HMPPS. As I said, there'll be future events. I'm thinking communications, I'm thinking staff, thinking probation, but if you have ideas, please let us know. In that follow-up email will be a request for feedback, and that helps shape not just how future events are run, but also what the events are about, and I'd be really grateful to hear your thoughts. And I guess finally, before I go, a very particular thank you to the HMPPS Insights team who have hosted and put together this event. It takes a lot of work behind the scenes and a lot of coordination, so I'm very grateful. What you may know, but if you don't, I'd like to bring to your attention is that the Insights 2022 event, the event of the year, is being organised. These are a huge number of fascinating and varied free events for people who are within or connected to the criminal justice system. I think my colleague Chris is going to post in the chat a link to that. But certainly you can go, thank you, Nick. You can go on to our Insights website to look up a flyer. And with that, not only is information about content, but if you too want to contribute and host an event, please get in touch with our team. I think that's probably everything. So just a thank you, and I hope it was useful, and hope to see you at the next event. Goodbye.